It was a long time ago, before he ever kissed her.
It was my 40th birthday. My husband had his hand on my sister's waist before he ever kissed her. I saw it in the reflection of my kitchen window in the middle of my own home, surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me the most. I did not scream. I did not drop the plate I was holding. I stood there and watched the two people I trusted more than anyone else in the world become strangers to me in the space of 4 seconds. And when I turned around to face the room full of laughter and candlelight, I smiled, because that is what you do when your entire life just changed and nobody else in the room knows it yet. I want you to sit with that for a second, because what happened after that moment is the part nobody expects. I told my family what I saw. I described it exactly the way it happened, calmly, without exaggeration, because I did not need to exaggerate anything. And instead of comfort, instead of outrage on my behalf, I was met with a wall of silence, followed by something worse than silence. My own parents, the two people who raised me, told me to let it go. My aunts told me I was being dramatic. My own mother looked me in the eye and asked me why I would want to destroy a family over one kiss. One kiss. As if that was the whole story, as if I did not know my husband and my sister well enough to know that a kiss like that does not happen out of nowhere. By the end of this video, you will understand why I did not just lose a husband and a sister that night. I lost an entire family, one relative at a time, over the course of a single year, and I want to tell you that I would do it again without hesitating. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Rachel, and for 18 years I believed I had built something solid. A husband named Daniel who I met in my 20s, back when we were both broke and ambitious and convinced we were going to figure life out together. A sister named Melissa who I had shared a childhood bedroom with, who I had defended on playgrounds, who I had stood beside at her own wedding as her maid of honor. These were not strangers. These were the two people I would have named first if you had asked me who I trusted most in the entire world. That is what makes this story different from the ones you have probably already heard. This was not a stranger's betrayal. This was a betrayal built from decades of closeness, which is exactly why nobody believed how deep it actually went, not even me, not at first. There are 3 questions I want you to hold on to as this story unfolds, because every piece of what I am about to tell you circles back to them. The first question is simple. Was that kiss at my birthday party really the first time, or was it the moment I simply happened to catch what had already been happening for a very long time? The second question is harder to sit with. Why did my own family, the people who raised me and the people who grew up beside me, choose to protect the two people who betrayed me instead of protecting me? And the third question is the one that took me the longest to answer honestly. What was I not allowing myself to see in the years leading up to that party, because some part of me may have already known? I'm not going to rush through the answers, because I do not think this story deserves to be rushed. I want you to understand who Daniel was before he became the man in that reflection. And I want you to understand who Melissa was to me before she became the person standing beside him. I want you to understand the kind of family I grew up in, the kind that smiled through every holiday photo while quietly deciding behind closed doors who deserved protection and who deserved to be managed. Because once you understand that, the birthday party stops being the beginning of the story. It becomes the moment everything I had spent my whole life refusing to see finally became impossible to ignore. What you are about to hear is not a story about jealousy, and it is not a simple story about a cheating husband, because if it were that simple I would not still be talking about it years later. This is a story about the quiet agreements families make without ever saying them out loud, about who is allowed to make mistakes and who is expected to absorb them, and about what happens when one person finally decides she is done absorbing anything. I lived that decision. I am still living the aftermath of it. And by the time this story ends, I want you to ask yourself honestly whether you would have done what I did, or whether you would have done what my family begged me to do, which was simply to get over it. To understand how I ended up standing in my own kitchen watching my marriage end in a reflection, you have to understand who Daniel was to me for almost 2 decades. We met when I was 23, waiting tables to pay for community college, and he was the quiet regular who always sat in the same booth and always left a decent tip. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who swept me off my feet with grand gestures. He was steady, and after the childhood I had, steady felt like the most attractive thing in the world. We built a life slowly, on purpose, the way you build something you intend to keep. A small apartment first, then a house we saved for together, then a marriage that survived job losses, a miscarriage, and the kind of ordinary hardship that either breaks 2 people or bonds them permanently. For most of our marriage, I would have told you it bonded us. Daniel showed up. He remembered the anniversary of my miscarriage every single year without me having to remind him. He drove 4 hours to sit in a hospital waiting room when my father had heart surgery, and he did it without complaint. I built my trust in him the same way you build a house, one small dependable choice at a time, until eventually the structure feels permanent enough that you stop checking the foundation. Looking back now, I can point to a handful of moments that should have made me check it. A joke that landed strangely at a family dinner, a comment from a friend that I brushed off too quickly. At the time, none of it seemed worth examining. I had no reason to examine it. That was the whole design of it. Melissa is 2 years younger than me, and for most of my life she was not just my sister, she was my closest friend. We shared a bedroom until I left for college. I taught her how to drive. I stood beside her at her own wedding, holding her flowers while she said vows to a man she later divorced. When our parents fought, we used to sit on the stairs together and listen through the vents, and afterward we would whisper in the dark about what kind of family we wanted to build someday, the kind where nobody had to sit on stairs and listen through vents. Melissa was magnetic in a way I never was. People gravitated toward her without trying. Growing up, I did not resent that about her. I admired it. I never once imagined that the same magnetism that drew people toward her at parties would eventually draw my own husband. If you want to understand why nobody in my family believed me that night, you have to understand the family I come from, because this story is not only about a marriage and a sister, it is about a system that had been operating quietly for years before Daniel and Melissa ever became a problem inside it. My parents raised us on the unspoken rule that conflict was something to be managed rather than resolved. Arguments were smoothed over before dinner ended. Disagreements were something you apologized your way out of, regardless of who was actually at fault, because keeping the peace at the table mattered more than being honest at the table. I did not see it clearly until much later, but our family had a long history of deciding, quietly and without ever saying it out loud, which family members' comfort mattered most in any given moment, and it was rarely mine. There was one memory from years earlier that I did not think about again until long after the birthday party, but once I did, I could not stop thinking about it. My father's business had failed when I was in my late 20s, and for a few months my parents leaned on Melissa financially instead of me, even though I offered first and was in a far better position to help. When I asked my mother why, gently, without any real accusation behind it, she told me that Melissa needed to feel needed and that I was strong enough to handle being the one who was not chosen. I remember that phrase exactly, strong enough to handle being the one who was not chosen. I did not know it then, but that sentence would end up explaining almost everything that happened years later, including why nobody in my family thought a kiss at my birthday party was worth losing their peace over. By the time my 40th birthday arrived, I had spent 18 years building a marriage I was proud of, and 38 years building a relationship with a sister I loved without condition, inside a family that had quietly trained all of us to protect comfort over honesty. I did not know any of that consciously on the morning of that party. I was excited. I hung string lights across the backyard myself. I ordered a cake with too much frosting because Daniel loves too much frosting. I invited the people I trusted most in the world into my home to celebrate turning 40, with absolutely no idea that by the end of the night, I would understand exactly how little my comfort had ever actually mattered to any of them. The morning of my 40th birthday started the way most good mornings start, with no warning at all. Daniel brought me coffee in bed and told me he had a surprise planned for later, which turned out to be a bracelet I still have not been able to bring myself to throw away. I spent the afternoon in the backyard hanging string lights between the 2 oak trees we had planted the year we bought the house, arranging folding chairs, setting out the good tablecloth my mother had given me for my wedding. I remember feeling genuinely happy in a simple, uncomplicated way, the kind of happiness you only get to feel a few times a year if you are lucky. I had no idea that I was decorating the setting for the worst night of my adult life, and I think that is part of what makes this so hard to talk about, even now. Guests started arriving around 6. My parents came first, then my aunts and uncles, then a handful of close friends I had known since college. Melissa arrived a little after 7, wearing a dress I remembered complimenting months earlier, and Daniel greeted her the exact same way he always did, with a quick hug and an easy joke about her being late. Nothing about it looked unusual. Nothing about it felt unusual. If you had shown me a video of that exact moment before I knew what I know now, I would have told you it was just two people who had known each other for 18 years being comfortable around one another. That is what makes betrayal like this so difficult to catch in real time. It does not announce itself. It hides inside behavior that looks exactly like normal family affection until the very last second. The party moved the way parties like that always move, in loose, overlapping conversations, plates of food, someone's kids running between the folding chairs, my father telling the same story about my childhood that he tells at every single gathering. At some point, close to 8, I slipped inside to get the cake out of the refrigerator, wanting to bring it out before anyone had to ask. My kitchen window faces the backyard, angled just right that in the evening light with the house lit up behind me and the yard darker outside, the glass turns into something closer to a mirror than a window. I was reaching for the cake when the reflection caught my attention, two shapes standing near the side door, half hidden by the shadow of the house. I did not immediately understand what I was looking at because my mind was not prepared to understand it. I saw Daniel's hand settle on Melissa's waist first, and for one full second I told myself it was nothing, the same way you tell yourself a lot of things in the half second before your brain catches up to what your eyes already know. Then I watched him lean toward her, and I watched her not step away. I stood completely still, cake in my hands, watching my husband kiss my sister through the reflection of my own kitchen window on the night of my 40th birthday in my own backyard, surrounded by every person who was supposed to love me the most. It lasted only a few seconds. It has lasted in my memory every day since. I want to be honest about what happened in my body in that moment because I think people expect a scene and there was no scene. There was no plate shattering on the floor, no scream, no dramatic confrontation through the glass. My hands did not even shake. Something in me went completely quiet and completely clear at the same time, the way I imagine it feels right before you make a decision you will spend the rest of your life standing behind. I set the cake down carefully. I smoothed my dress. And I walked back outside into a yard full of laughter, string lights, and people singing happy birthday to a woman none of them yet understood had just watched her entire life change in the space of 4 seconds. I smiled through the candles. I made a wish I will never tell anyone, though I think you can probably guess what it was. I hugged my sister when she congratulated me on turning 40, and I felt absolutely nothing warm in that hug, only the strange, hollow sensation of holding someone I no longer recognized. Daniel refilled my glass later that night and told me the party had turned out perfectly. I said it had. And somewhere underneath that entire performance, a decision was already forming that neither of them had any idea was coming, one that would not arrive that night or the next morning, but that had already, quietly, become inevitable the second I saw that reflection in the glass. The party ended a little after 11, and I waited until the last car pulled out of the driveway before I said a single word to Daniel about what I had seen. I did not want an audience for what was coming, and some quiet part of me still wanted to give him the chance to tell me the truth on his own, without me having to drag it out of him. I sat down across from him at our kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten dinner together thousands of times, and I told him exactly what I saw through that window. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply described it back to him, moment by moment, and watched his face change from confusion to something closer to panic. His first response was denial, flat and immediate, the kind of denial that comes out before a person has even had time to think of a believable lie. Then when he realized I was not going to back down or accept a vague explanation, the denial shifted into minimizing. It was nothing. It was a moment. I was misreading something that meant nothing at all. He told me I was overreacting, that I was letting one small lapse in judgment threaten 18 years of marriage over a misunderstanding. I remember sitting there, watching a man I had built an entire life with try to convince me that my own eyes had lied to me. And I remember understanding, very clearly, that this was not the first time he had needed a story ready in case someone caught him. I called Melissa the next morning. I did not scream at her either, though I think part of her expected me to. Her response was different from Daniel's, but somehow just as familiar. She did not deny it outright the way he had. Instead, she told me it was complicated, that things had been building for a while and she had not known how to bring it up, that she never meant for it to happen this way. I asked her what she meant by things had been building for a while, and she went quiet on the phone in a way that told me more than any answer could have. That silence was the first moment I understood that whatever I had witnessed at that party was not the beginning of something. It was simply the moment I finally happened to see it. I told my parents 3 days later, sitting in their living room, the same living room where I had grown up watching them smooth over every disagreement before dinner ended. I described exactly what I saw calmly, the same way I had described it to Daniel. I expected shock. I expected outrage on my behalf. What I got instead was my mother's face tightening into the same expression she used to make right before she asked us to apologize to each other for fighting, regardless of who had actually done something wrong. She asked me if I was certain about what I saw. She asked me if I had considered that I might be misinterpreting something during a stressful, overstimulating party. And then she said the sentence that I have not been able to forget since. She told me not to let one mistake destroy an entire family. Within a week, the story had made its way through every branch of my family, and the response was almost identical each time, as if everyone had quietly agreed on the same script without ever discussing it. My aunts told me I was being dramatic. My cousins told me these things happen and marriages survive worse. An uncle I rarely speak to sent me a message telling me to think about the holidays, about the years of family gatherings I was risking over what he called a moment of poor judgment. Get over it became the phrase I heard more times that month than I had heard in the previous 10 years combined, spoken gently, spoken firmly, spoken as though it were simple, obvious advice rather than a request for me to carry the weight of everyone else's comfort on my own. What none of them understood, and what I did not fully understand myself yet, was that I was no longer only grieving a single kiss at a birthday party. I was beginning to see piece by piece that my family had likely known something, or at the very least suspected something long before I ever caught it myself. Small comments I had dismissed over the years started resurfacing in my memory with new weight behind them. A joke my cousin made 2 Christmases ago that nobody else laughed at. My mother's odd insistence more than once that Daniel and Melissa simply got along well because they were similar people. I had spent years explaining away small, uncomfortable moments because the explanation was easier than the alternative. Now I could not stop counting them. 3 weeks after the party, unable to sleep, I picked up Daniel's phone while he was in the shower, not entirely sure what I was looking for, only knowing that I needed to look. What I found that night did not answer every question I had, but it answered enough of them to tell me that the story I had been told about one mistake, one moment of poor judgment at a party was not the truth. It was the version of the truth that was easiest for everyone else to live with. What I found on Daniel's phone that night was a thread of messages between him and Melissa going back almost 3 years, hidden inside an app I did not even know he had installed, one designed to look like a calculator until you entered the right code. I sat on the edge of our bathroom floor reading through them while the shower ran behind me, and with every message I scrolled past, the story I had been told at that kitchen table, the story about one small lapse in judgment at a party, fell further and further apart. This was not a single mistake. This was 3 years of conversations, some late at night, some during family gatherings I had been present for, some sent while I was in the next room. 3 years of a relationship I had no idea existed, hidden inside my own family, inside my own home, inside holidays I remember as some of the happiest of my life. I did not confront either of them that night. I needed time to understand what I was actually looking at, so I copied what I could, screenshotted what I could, and closed the app before Daniel came out of the shower, sitting across from him at dinner an hour later as though nothing had changed, when in reality everything had. Looking back, I think that was the moment I stopped being the version of myself my family had always known, the version who smoothed things over, who gave people the benefit of the doubt, who absorbed discomfort so other people did not have to feel it. I spent the next several days quietly gathering more, piecing together a timeline, cross-referencing dates against family events I remembered clearly, building something I could not be talked out of believing. What the messages revealed was not just an affair, though that alone would have been enough to end my marriage. They revealed a pattern of behavior that both Daniel and Melissa had been carefully managing for years, coordinating explanations in advance, discussing how to behave around me at gatherings so I would not suspect anything, at one point even joking in writing about how easily I trusted people. Reading that particular message was the moment something in my chest finally broke open completely, not because of the affair itself anymore, but because of the casual cruelty behind it, the quiet, ongoing decision to treat my trust as something convenient rather than something sacred. There was one message, sent almost 2 years earlier, that changed the direction of this entire story for me. Melissa had written to Daniel that she was worried our mother suspected something after a comment she made at Thanksgiving. Daniel told her not to worry, that our mother would never bring it up even if she did suspect something, because our mother, in his words, would always choose keeping the family together over telling me an uncomfortable truth. I read that sentence more times than I can count. It confirmed something I had already begun to feel in my bones since that conversation in my parents' living room, that the people telling me to get over it were not simply choosing peace over conflict. Some of them may have already known exactly what I was being asked to get over. I confronted all three of them together, 2 weeks later, at what was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday dinner at my parents' house. I brought printed copies of what I had found and set them on the table without a word, watching the color drain from Daniel's face, watching Melissa's hands go still around her fork, watching my mother's eyes move across the pages with an expression that told me everything I needed to know before she ever said a single word in her own defense. Daniel tried to explain. Melissa tried to apologize. My mother, when I finally asked her directly whether she had known, did not deny it the way I expected her to. She simply said she had hoped it would resolve itself quietly without anyone getting hurt. Without anyone getting hurt. I sat at that table and let that sentence settle over me completely, understanding for the first time that in my family's mind I had already been hurt long before that Thanksgiving comment, long before the birthday party, long before any of us sat down at that table. I had simply been the last one to find out. The last one in a family full of people who had decided, quietly and separately and without ever discussing it out loud, that protecting the peace of the family meant protecting Daniel and Melissa's secret, and that my comfort, my trust, my right to know the truth about my own marriage, mattered less than everyone else's ability to keep sitting at the same table together. I left my parents' house that Sunday evening and drove home in complete silence, no radio, no phone calls, just my own thoughts settling into place mile after mile. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I already knew what I was going to do, and it was not simply divorce Daniel, though that part was obvious and immediate. I was going to remove myself entirely from a family system that had spent years deciding my comfort mattered less than everyone else's. Not just Daniel, not just Melissa. My parents, who had known or suspected and said nothing. The aunts and uncles who told me to get over it without ever once asking me how I was actually doing. I filed for divorce within the month, and I sent one message to my extended family explaining, briefly and without anger, that I would not be attending family gatherings for the foreseeable future. The response was immediate and in some ways exactly what I expected. My phone did not stop for weeks. Messages from cousins telling me I was overreacting, from aunts telling me I was punishing people who had nothing to do with it, from my father who called 4 times in one evening asking me to reconsider before I did something I could not take back. Melissa reached out repeatedly, alternating between apology and justification, sometimes in the same message. My mother sent the longest message of all, 3 paragraphs explaining that she only ever wanted to protect the family, as though protecting the family and protecting me had ever been the same thing in her mind. I read every message. I did not respond to most of them. I had spent 38 years being the one who absorbed everyone else's discomfort, and I was done volunteering for that role. The divorce finalized a little over a year after that birthday party. Daniel and Melissa are together now, publicly, and from what I hear through the small handful of relatives who still speak to me, most of my family has quietly accepted it as simply the way things turned out. I do not know if that is true peace or just another version of the same smoothing over I grew up watching my whole life. What I do know is that I no longer live inside it. I moved into a smaller house on the other side of town, one with a kitchen window that does not face a backyard full of people I am not sure I can trust. Some mornings that quiet still feels like grief, other mornings it feels like the first honest silence I have had in years. About 8 months after I cut everyone off, I received a message from an aunt I had always been close to growing up, someone who had stayed largely quiet during the initial fallout. She told me she had suspected something about Daniel and Melissa for nearly 2 years before that birthday party, based on things she had noticed at family gatherings, but that she had said nothing because she assumed it was not her place, and because she did not want to be the one who broke the family apart. She apologized not for what Daniel and Melissa had done but for her own silence, for choosing comfort the same way everyone else had. I appreciated the honesty, even that late. But I also understood, reading it, that her apology could not undo the years I had spent being the only one in the room who did not know the truth about my own life. I do not regret cutting my family off, even on the hardest days, even on holidays when the silence from that side of my life feels especially loud. What I understand now, in a way I could not have understood standing in my kitchen that night, is that the kiss I saw through that window was never really the injury. The injury was everything that came after it, every person who asked me to carry the discomfort of the truth so that they would not have to. I am not angry anymore most days. I am simply someone who finally stopped mistaking peace for safety and family for unconditional loyalty. If you ever find yourself in a room full of people who love you but who love their own comfort more than they love your right to the truth, I hope you remember this story, and I hope it gives you permission to choose yourself the way I finally chose myself that year.